Good evening, and to our Arabic speakers, I say Salamu Alaikum. Jesus of Nazareth is the most influential person who ever lived. 20th centuries after his death, he continues to exert his power of fascination over the minds of men and women. But who is Jesus really? I believe that the key to answering that question lies in the purported fact of his resurrection. If Jesus really did rise from the dead, then he must have been who he claimed to be. And therefore, we've come together tonight to discuss the question, did Jesus of Nazareth rise from the dead? Now, it's important for you to understand that in our discussion, I'm not going to treat the New Testament as an inspired and therefore inerrant book, but simply as a collection of ordinary Greek documents coming down out of the first century. I'm not interested, therefore, in discussing the inerrancy of the Gospels. Rather, we're interested in determining what facts they credibly establish concerning Jesus' fate and what is the best explanation of those facts. Accordingly, in tonight's debate, I'm going to defend two basic contentions. One, the New Testament documents establish 5 facts concerning Jesus: his crucifixion, his burial in a tomb, the discovery that his tomb was empty, his post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. And 2, the best explanation of these facts is that God raised Jesus from the dead. So let's look at that first contention together. I'm going to share with you 5 facts about the historical Jesus which are accepted by the majority of New Testament historians today. Fact number 1, Jesus was tried and executed by crucifixion. All right? Okay. Fact number 1 then was that Jesus was tried and executed by crucifixion. According to the Gospels, Jesus was condemned by the Jewish high court on the charge of blasphemy and then delivered over to the Romans for execution for treason for claiming to be king of the Jews. Not only are these facts multiply attested by independent biblical sources like Paul and the Acts of the Apostles, but they are also confirmed by extra-biblical sources. From the Jewish historian Josephus and the Syrian writer Marabar Serapion, we learn that Jewish leaders made a formal accusation against Jesus and participated in the events leading up to his crucifixion. From the Babylonian Talmud, we learn that Jewish involvement in the trial was explained as a proper undertaking against a heretic. And from Josephus and the Roman historian Tacitus, we learn that Jesus was crucified by Roman authority under the sentence of Pontius Pilate. According to Luke Johnson, a New Testament historian at Emory University, the support for the mode of his death, its agents, and perhaps its co-agents, is overwhelming. Jesus faced a trial before his death, was condemned, and executed by crucifixion. Perhaps the single most egregious error found historically in the Quran is its claim that Jesus was not in fact crucified, Surah 4:157. Not only is there not a single shred of evidence for this remarkable hypothesis, but the evidence supporting Jesus' crucifixion is, as Johnson says, overwhelming. No historian believes that Jesus was not crucified. The crucifixion of Jesus is recognized even by the most radical critics as, to quote Robert Funk, one indisputable fact. Indeed, Paula Fredrickson, a skeptical critic, declares flatly the crucifixion is the strongest single fact we have about Jesus. Fact number 2, after his crucifixion, Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb. This fact is highly significant because it means that the location of Jesus' tomb was known. New Testament historians have established the fact of Jesus' honorable burial on the basis of evidence such as the following. 1. Jesus' burial is attested in the very old information handed on by Paul in his first letter to the Corinthians. In the 15th chapter, Paul writes, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. This old information handed on by Paul has been dated to within 5 years of Jesus' crucifixion. The second clause in the formula refers to Jesus' burial. Comparison of this four-line formula to the gospel narratives on the one hand and to the sermons in the Acts of the Apostles on the other hand reveals that the second clause is a summary in outline form of the story of Jesus' burial by Joseph in a tomb. Number 2, the burial story is part of very old source material used by Mark in writing his gospel. Since Mark is the earliest of the Gospels, his source material goes back even closer to the events of Jesus' life. And thus we have very early, independent attestation of the burial in both Mark and Paul. 3, as a member of the Jewish high court that condemned Jesus, Joseph of Arimathea is unlikely to be a Christian invention. There was an understandable hostility in the early church toward the Jewish leaders who, in Christian eyes, had engineered a judicial murder of Jesus. Thus, according to the late New Testament scholar Raymond Brown, Jesus' burial by Joseph is very probable since a Christian fictional creation of a Jewish Sanhedrist who does what is right by Jesus is almost inexplicable. 4, the burial story lacks any signs of legendary development. Dale Allison, an eminent historical Jesus scholar, observes, Mark's story of Jesus' burial by Joseph contains neither fantastic elements nor Christian motifs, and so creates no impression of being a legend. 5, no other competing burial story exists. If the story of Jesus' burial were a legendary fiction which arose much later than the original event, then it's strange that we have no traces at all of the real account or even competing legendary stories. The unanimity of the burial traditions speaks in favor of the reliability of the gospel account. For these and other reasons, the majority of New Testament critics concur that Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb. According to the late John A.T. Robinson of Cambridge University, the burial of Jesus in the tomb is one of the earliest and best attested facts about Jesus. Fact number 3, on the Sunday after the crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers. Among the reasons which have led most scholars to this conclusion are the following. 1, the old information transmitted by Paul implies the empty tomb. The expression, he was raised, following the expression, he was buried, implies an empty tomb. A first-century Jew could not have thought otherwise. The reference is being made here to Jesus' empty tomb is again evident by comparing this 4-line formula with the gospel narratives and with the book of Acts. The third line is a summary of the empty tomb narrative. Thus, in Paul's information, we have extremely early evidence of the fact of the empty tomb. 2, the empty tomb story is also part of Mark's very old source material. Mark's source did not end with Jesus' burial, but with the empty tomb narrative, which is tied to the burial account verbally and grammatically. And thus we have, again, very early, independent attestation of the fact of the empty tomb. Number 3, the story is simple and lacks signs of legendary embellishment. In Mark's account, the women come to the tomb early Sunday morning and find the stone rolled away and the tomb empty. They see an angelic figure who proclaims to them that Jesus is risen and will appear to them in Galilee. They then flee from the tomb in terror and silence. Now, to appreciate the simplicity of this account, you have only to compare it to the accounts in the forged apocryphal Gospels of the 2nd century and beyond. They are colored by all sorts of apologetical and theological motifs which are conspicuously missing from the account in the book of Mark. At the very most, the critical historian would only want to excise from Mark's account the angelic figure as an embellishment, and what then remains is stark in its simplicity. 4, the tomb was discovered empty by women. In Jewish society, the testimony of women was regarded as untrustworthy. Now, in light of this fact, how remarkable it is that it is women who are the discoverers of Jesus' empty tomb. Any later legendary account would certainly have made male disciples, like Peter or John, discover the empty tomb. The fact that it is women rather than men who are the chief witnesses to the fact of the empty tomb is best explained by the fact that they were the discoverers of the empty tomb, and the gospel writers faithfully record what for them was an awkward and embarrassing fact. 5, the earliest Jewish response presupposes the empty tomb. In Matthew's gospel, we find the earliest Jewish response to the disciples' proclamation of the resurrection. What were Jews saying in response to the disciples' proclamation, "He is risen from the dead"? That these men were full of new wine? That Jesus' body still lay in the tomb there in the hillside? No, they said the disciples came and stole away his body. Now think about that for a minute. The disciples came and stole away his body. The earliest Jewish response to the proclamation of the resurrection was itself an attempt to explain why the body was missing. And thus we have evidence for the empty tomb from the very opponents of the early Christian movement itself. I could go on, but I think enough has been said to indicate why, in the words of Jakob Kramer, an Austrian specialist, by far most exegetes hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements concerning the empty tomb. Fact number 4. On multiple occasions and under various circumstances, different individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive after his death. This is a fact which is universally acknowledged among New Testament scholars for the following reasons. 1, the list of eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection appearances, which is quoted by Paul, guarantees that such appearances occurred. The old formula quoted by Paul goes on to say, "Then he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me." Given the early date of this information, as well as Paul's personal acquaintance with the people involved, such appearances cannot be dismissed as legendary, but must refer to actual events. Secondly, the appearance narratives in the Gospels provide multiple independent attestation of the appearances. For example, the appearance to Peter is attested by Luke and Paul. The appearance to the 12 is attested by Luke, John, and Paul. The appearance to the women is attested by Matthew and John. and appearances in Galilee are attested by Mark, Matthew, and John. The appearance narrative spans such a breadth of independent sources that it cannot be reasonably denied that the earliest disciples did have such experiences. Even the skeptical New Testament critic Gert Ludemann therefore concludes, and I quote, "It may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ." Finally, fact number 5. The original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that Jesus was risen from the dead despite every predisposition to the contrary. Think of the situation the disciples faced following Jesus' crucifixion. Number 1, their leader was dead, and Jewish messianic expectations had no idea of a Messiah who, instead of triumphing over Israel's enemies, would be shamefully executed by them as a criminal. As Shabir Ali himself has put it, for a Jew, the idea of a crucified Messiah is as inconceivable as a married bachelor. 2, according to Old Testament law, Jesus' crucifixion exposed him as a heretic, a man literally accursed by God. According to the law of Moses, anyone who is hanged on a tree as a criminal is under God's curse. The Jews also applied this law to anyone who was crucified as Jesus was. And 3, Jewish beliefs about the afterlife precluded anyone's rising from the dead to glory and immortality before the general resurrection at the end of the world. Nevertheless, the original disciples suddenly came to believe so strongly that God had raised Jesus from the dead that they were willing to go to their deaths for the truth of that belief. Luke Johnson states, "Some sort of powerful, transformative experience is required to generate the sort of movement earliest Christianity was." And N.T. Wright, an eminent British scholar, concludes, "That is why, as an historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him." In summary, then, there are 5 facts which are agreed upon today by the majority of scholars who have written on the subject: Jesus' trial and crucifixion, his burial by Joseph of Arimathea, the discovery of his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. And thus the majority of scholars would agree with my first contention this evening. But that leads to my second basic contention, that the best explanation of these facts is that God raised Jesus from the dead. In his book, Justifying Historical Descriptions, historian C.B. McCullough lists 6 tests which historians use in determining what is the best explanation for given historical facts. The hypothesis, God raised Jesus from the dead, passes all 6 of these tests. Number 1, it has great explanatory scope. It explains why the tomb was found empty, why the disciples saw post-mortem appearances of Jesus, and why the Christian faith came into being. Number 2, it has great explanatory power. It explains why the body of Jesus was gone, why people repeatedly saw Jesus alive, despite his earlier public execution, and so forth. 3, it is plausible, given the historical context of Jesus' own unparalleled life and claims. The resurrection serves as divine vindication of those claims. 4, it is not ad hoc or contrived. It requires only one additional hypothesis, that God exists. And even that needn't be an additional hypothesis if you already believe in God's existence, as Shabir and I do. 5, it is in accord with accepted beliefs. The hypothesis, God raised Jesus from the dead, does not in any way conflict with the accepted belief that people don't rise naturally from the dead. The Christian accepts that belief as wholeheartedly as he accepts the belief that God raised Jesus from the dead. And number 6, it far outstrips any of its rival hypotheses in meeting conditions 1 to 5. Down through history, various alternative explanations of the facts have been offered. For example, the conspiracy theory, the apparent death theory, the hallucination theory, and so forth. Such hypotheses have been almost universally rejected by contemporary scholarship. No naturalistic hypothesis has attracted a great number of scholars. So on this basis, it seems to me that we should conclude that the best explanation of the evidence is the one that the original disciples themselves gave, namely, God raised Jesus from the dead.
Generous introduction, and Anik as well. Thank you, John, for inviting me to this forum, and Dr. Craig, thank you for giving me the opportunity to share this platform with you. It is indeed my honor and great pleasure. I begin by praising God as usual, but before I go any further, I realize that debates, especially of a theological kind, generally are taken very seriously. Sometimes we get too serious, and I thought I'll just share this with you. On my way here, I picked this up as a piece of memorabilia. It says on it, Montreal was so expensive, I could only afford half a mug. And indeed, it is only half a mug. And how this relates to tonight's debate, of course, is that in a debating situation, each side is expected only to present one side of the argument. And that is different from an academic discourse in which each person would have the obligation of presenting the whole discussion with all of its pros and cons, pluses and minuses, in favor and against, and so on. But for us to make sense of our debate, we have to think of the whole mug. We need to put together what Dr. Craig says and what I say. And in fact, our debate tonight will bring together, I hope, people in dialogue, Christians and Muslims, so that what one person knows will add to what the other person knows, and together we will complete the mugs. In fact, I would like to present this to my good friend, Dr. Craig. Now, I didn't mean to take extra time for that. I hope that that also counts within my 20 minutes. Dr. Craig has said much already, and what I have to say will obviously tag on to what he has said, so I don't have to repeat much of the background information that he's already given you. I want in my first presentation to not respond directly to what he has said. I've taken careful notes of what he has said, and when I come back for a rebuttal, at that time I think it'll be more appropriate to respond directly to some of the issues. Here I'd like to lay out some broad points of my own, and naturally there's going to be some inevitable rebuttals indirectly to what he has said, but please bear with me for that. First, what does the Quran actually say about the crucifixion of Jesus? Actually, Muslim scholars are not very sure, and that is not something unique with regards to this reference regarding Jesus. The Quran is a book consisting of 6,000 and more verses, and they deal with a wide variety of subjects, many subjects just being touched upon. Some main important components of Muslim belief are expounded again and again, such as our belief in monotheism in one God, our belief in the communication from God through the Quran itself and the life of the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, and our belief in the life hereafter. But apart from the most central and core concepts that the Quran teaches, other issues are touched upon very lightly, and that leaves Muslim commentators within a wide range of possibilities to give as a meaning of various verses. When it comes to the verse dealing with the crucifixion of Jesus, then, we're dealing with something that's peripheral to the belief of Muslims. It is central to the belief of Muslims to believe that Jesus is the prophet of God. And it is central to the belief of Muslims to believe in every verse of the Quran as a divine revelation. But that does not impose on Muslims to accept every interpretation of every verse. And as in this case, we have a variety of interpretations offered for Surah 4, verse 157. In the classical period, however, I find that almost universally the Muslim commentators have said that Jesus was not put on a cross, but someone else was made to resemble Jesus, and that someone else was put on the cross. So in this way, God fooled the enemies of Jesus who wanted to crucify him. However, in my own study of this very carefully, reading the classical commentators and modern, I find that there is no reason for holding that particular belief. It seems that the Muslim commentators on the Quran spoke to informers, for those who were Jews and Christians and had some familiarity with the Judeo-Christian scriptural background, and they used that information coupled with a very literalistic approach to interpreting the Quran text, and more literalistic than you might imagine, because in that case they did not just take a verse literally as it says, but they took every word literally as it said, disjointed from the surrounding words and the rest of the Quranic context. It seems then that on the whole, what the Quran is saying is that even though the enemies of Jesus tried to crucify him, or they boasted that they killed him and crucified him, they didn't kill him, they didn't crucify him, it only appeared so to them. And those who are in a difference about the matter, or those who would differ about the matter, are in hopeless confusion about it. They have no certain knowledge, but God raised him to himself, and they killed him not for certain. So from that brief narrative in the Quran, one could not really build such an elaborate theory that someone else was made to look like Jesus and put on the cross instead. You may have questions about the specific wording of that passage and how the commentators came to their understanding that I've just explained, but we'll deal with that as it comes. So in brief then, it seems to me that the Quran does not necessitate the belief that someone else was put on the cross, and does not deny the fact that Jesus was put on the cross. It just denies that the enemies of Jesus, who boasted that they killed him, really had the upper hand on him. And that, of course, can give rise to a variety of interpretations as well, of what really was the solution and what exactly happened. Well, as a Muslim, I'm not required to know what happened, because this is not one of the central beliefs of Islam, as I have explained to you, and I could be open to a variety of interpretations. But now, having explained briefly where the Muslim comes from at this subject, I would like to take a suggestion from Paniker that when we enter into religious dialogue, we should have the ability to leave aside what we believe for the moment, suspend our own beliefs in order to be able to listen to the other side. Otherwise, interaction and dialogue becomes impossible. And if we're just simply in the debating mode trying to disprove, we may not be able to improve on what we believe or help others to improve on what they believe. So let's think about what a Muslim may find if he comes to the New Testament scriptures, if he were to leave his own beliefs suspended for the moment. Well, as a Muslim, what do I find? Now, no longer thinking as a Muslim, but as a reasonable person approaching the scriptures, I should be aware, having said this much, that no one is completely unbiased, and everyone does, no matter how much he tries, come to whatever he's studying with some degree of bias. So we have to be aware of that and call it when we see it. So now here we have the New Testament documents which tell us about the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. We have 4 Gospels. One of the Gospels is unique, the Gospel according to Luke, in that it is followed by a second volume, thus not ending with the resurrection appearances of Jesus, but also with something about the life and teachings of his disciples after him. So we get a fuller and connected account here, and we can see what happened with Jesus and what happened afterwards. So to zoom in on the portion that most concerns us tonight, we're looking at the last couple of chapters of Luke's Gospel. So Jesus is said to have been crucified on a Friday. It was the day before the Sabbath, and because the Jews had the law that precluded leaving someone up hanging on a cross on a Sabbath day, they hurriedly buried Jesus, not under the earth, but in some kind of an open chamber, in a tomb. And they put a rock against the tomb. The following day was the Sabbath, so the followers of Jesus, being practitioners obviously of the Jewish faith up until this point, observed the Sabbath, but then early on Sunday morning, some of the women followers came to visit the tomb and they found it empty. They saw a visitation of a couple of angels who informed them that Jesus had actually risen from the dead. With this news, they told the disciples. A couple of the disciples came and examined the tomb as well. And eventually, Jesus will appear to a couple of his disciples who walked on a country road, and then to a group of disciples as they sat in the upper room. Luke's gospel ends by telling us that after this appearance to the disciples, Jesus ascended to heaven. But then the second volume, Acts of the Apostles, continues to tell us that Jesus actually appeared to his disciples over a period of 40 days. And of course, 50 days after the Passover, the occasion on when Jesus was said to have been crucified, we have Pentecost. And on that occasion, the disciples, together with many onlookers, received an extraordinary appearance. They received the infusion of the Holy Spirit. With that, they preached to the crowd about the fact of Jesus' resurrection, and many were converted on the spot. So now that's the broad outline. But then what are the details? We have not only Luke's gospel, but we have Matthew, Mark, and John. And Dr. Craig has told us that Mark was written first. Most scholars today will agree that Matthew and Luke actually copied from Mark. But they didn't just simply slavishly copied. They also made embellishments as they go. They added, they removed, or rather failed to mention, and they made improvements as they went. And as we study these Gospels in comparison with Mark, we will see the improvements that they made. In fact, this whole story that I've given you is only partially related in Mark. Mark actually stops at chapter 16, verse number 8, with the verse that Dr. Craig told us about, where the women fled from the tomb in fear and astonishment, and they said nothing to anybody because they were afraid. Now, many people obviously were not happy with this ending of Mark's gospel. This is how it appears in the oldest manuscripts that we have. So we also find some other endings floating around. There is a so-called longer ending, another so-called shorter ending, and then in a manuscript kept in a library in Washington called the Phreologion, named after the library, there is even an insertion into the longer ending. So you have Mark's gospel stopping at verse number 8, then you have another 12 verses tacked on in what is called the longer ending, verses 9 to 20. And within those verses 9 to 20, you have a further insertion by somebody else in another variety of ending. And some manuscripts that did not have these endings have a shorter one, which just simply tells us in brief that these women did in fact go and relate everything to the disciples. So all of the appearances that are mentioned in Luke's gospel are in fact missing from Mark's gospel. All we have in Mark's gospel as it is now is a promise from a young man who the women saw at the tomb, who may be an angelic figure, but it's not specifically said so, who told them that Jesus is risen and they should tell his disciples to go to Galilee, for there they will see Jesus as he already told them. And that's it. The women fled from the tomb and said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Obviously, people were not happy with that ending of Mark, and they tacked on additional endings to now tell us the same sorts of things which Luke's gospel tells us. The women went and told the story, and the disciples eventually see Jesus. Mark was not happy with Matthew was also not happy with Mark's ending. Neither was Luke. So if we have Mark as the source, and then we have Matthew and Luke borrowing from Mark, what did they do with that particular verse which says that the women fled from the tomb and said nothing to anyone because they were afraid? Luke has it that the women understood already what the whole score was. They knew everything about what Jesus had said previous to his crucifixion, how he said that he is actually going to go through all of this and eventually rise from the dead. And so they eventually went and told the disciples. That's how Luke rephrases that verse. What does Matthew do? Matthew tells us, quite contrary to Mark, that the women fled from the tomb with fear and great joy, and they ran to tell the disciples. So you have a continuity with Mark's wording, but also a diversion from it and towards a new meaning. Now, Matthew has it that, in fact, the women, on their way to tell the disciples, actually meet Jesus. So you can see a development in the story, whereas in Mark's gospel, all they ever saw was a young man who may be an angel, but not necessarily so. Now in Matthew, he is definitely an angel, explicitly said to be so. He tells the women. And the women not only go to tell Jesus about what some angel said, but in fact, they can actually report now that they met Jesus themselves. Now, the message of the angel in Mark's gospel was tell the disciples to go to Galilee. There they will see Jesus as he told them, meaning that Jesus had already told them this. And this is Jesus' message that the angel is giving to them. But in Matthew's gospel, the wording of the angel is changed. And scholars believe that the wording in Matthew's gospel is to make room for the fact that Jesus himself will appear to the women and he himself will tell them to tell the disciples to go to Galilee. So in Matthew's gospel, the angel actually tells them that I have told you. Not that this is Jesus' message to you, this is my message to you, because Jesus will give his own message. If the wordings of angels can be changed like this, then one wonders what else might have been changed. But if we ask about the substantial fact of where Jesus appeared and to whom and when, we can find no corroborating evidence from one gospel to another. Let's look at what happens. So let's go back to Luke's gospel again. Luke's gospel has the disciples seeing visitations of Jesus in and around Jerusalem. And that continues into Acts of the Apostles. And in Luke's gospel, Jesus, when he visits them, tells them specifically, you should stay in Jerusalem until that which has been promised will come to pass. And this is an obvious reference to the event of Pentecost. So they stay in Jerusalem, obviously, if they follow Jesus' command. But that's a very different and contrary command to the one given in Mark's gospel, that they're to go to Galilee, and in Matthew's gospel, that they're to go to Galilee. Either they're to go to Galilee to see Jesus, or they're going to remain in Jerusalem to see Jesus right here. Some scholars try to dovetail the various reports in order to make them fit together. Somebody may suggest, for example, that Jesus went to Galilee, he saw them there, and then came back to Jerusalem and saw them there as well, or they saw him. But as James Dunn, a reputable New Testament scholar, has put it, this actually is not possible because given the distance, it will take too much time to go to Galilee and come back to appear, not that it will take Jesus that much time, but it will take the disciples so much time to go to Galilee and come back to be there on Easter Sunday to see visitations of Jesus in Jerusalem. Raymond Brown as well, who according to Dr. Craig is one of the greatest New Testament scholars of our present time, actually says that to do it this way does violence to the textual material. It does not really allow for that. Now, we didn't say anything about John's gospel yet, but let's say something about that. I've already said that according to Luke's gospel, Jesus appeared on Easter Sunday to his disciples when they were in the upper room. And Luke specifically says that there were 11 disciples. John's gospel has it that Jesus did appear to his disciples on that occasion. He doesn't tell us the number of them. But he tells us that a week later, Jesus appeared when Thomas was present, with the clear implication and the clear statement that Thomas was absent on the first occasion, which means that there were only 10 disciples. Now, were there 10 or were there 11? According to Luke, there were 11. According to John, only 10. Now, how does John get this down to 10? Raymond Brown tells us that John, in fact, gave us a variety of the same narrative in order to demonstrate some apologetic motifs. He wanted to show us that Thomas, the doubting one, will have the same kinds of doubts that we readers of his Gospels may have even today, but the doubts were already answered. So Thomas wasn't there. Why? Because John removed him. Not in fact, but for the literary purpose of creating this discourse to prove a point. So if the writers are writing to prove points like this, then to what extent can we believe in their narratives? And can we really distill certain unavoidable facts from this sort of narrative that they have put before us, when we can see that they actually tailor the narrative to suit these apologetic motifs? Dr. Craig, in his book, Reasonable Faith, actually in the introduction, recommends another book, A History of Apologetics by Robert Dulles. And Robert Dulles, in his book, Dulles, in his book, actually tells us that the history of apologetics begins with the Gospels themselves. Each of the Gospel is an apologetic work. They're not academic discourses telling us all of the facts. They're giving us one side of that mug. And in order for us to understand the whole picture, we have to not only put all of the text together, but we also have to be circumspect. We have to look around to see if the rest of the mug is really there. Paul tells us that Jesus appeared to the 12. But by this time, there never was a 12. There were either 11 as in Luke, or there was 10 as in John. But there never was a 12 at this time, because of the 12 disciples, Judas Iscariot had betrayed Jesus, and he met his own deserved end. So maximum 11. How did Paul say 12? So you see then that the fact of who Jesus appeared to and when cannot be corroborated from one gospel to another. If Dr. Craig says, look, the multiple attestation, we do not have these multiple attestations. What we have is our individual reports that contradict each other in a fundamental way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ali. And we now invite up Dr. Craig for his 12-minute first rebuttal.
Well, I find myself in something of a quandary here in that I don't disagree with hardly anything that Shabir has just said in his speech. Remember, I said I would defend 5 facts in tonight's debate. First of all, that Jesus was tried and crucified, that he was buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb, that tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers on Sunday morning, that he then after appeared to various individuals and groups of people, and that the original disciples came to believe in his resurrection despite every predisposition to the contrary. And I gave multiple lines of evidence in favor of each of those points. Now, Shabir has quibbled about the details, but he hasn't disagreed with any of those points, because I think he knows that these are historical facts that are accepted by the majority of historians today. What he did do was exactly what I said in my first speech I would not do, namely worry about the inerrancy of the Gospels and the little details and secondary features of the narratives. Rather, what I'm focusing on is the historical core of these narratives, however you may want to judge the historicity of the secondary details. And the fact is that despite all of the inconsistencies that Shabir wants to mention, the core of these narratives is recognized as historical today. Michael Grant is a secular historian, and he writes this in his book, Jesus, an Historian's Review of the Gospel. True, the discovery of the empty tomb is differently described by the various Gospels. But, he says, if we apply the same sort of criteria that we would apply to any other ancient literary sources, then the evidence is firm and plausible enough to necessitate the conclusion that the tomb was indeed found empty. As an example, in secular ancient history, Livy and Polybius give us 2 irreconcilable accounts of Hannibal's campaign to cross the Alps with elephants in his war against Rome. They're incompatible with each other, but no doubts that Hannibal, in fact, did mount such a campaign against Rome. So the fact of the matter is that the gospel accounts are historical in their core, however you might judge these secondary details. In fact, all 4 gospels agree that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified in Jerusalem by Roman authority during the Passover feast, having been arrested and convicted on charges of blasphemy by the Jewish Sanhedrin, and then slandered before the Roman governor Pilate on charges of treason. He died within several hours and was buried Friday afternoon by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb which was sealed with a stone. Certain women followers of Jesus, including Mary Magdalene, mentioned by name, having observed his interment, visited his tomb early on Sunday morning, only to find it empty. Thereafter, Jesus appeared alive from the dead to the disciples, including Peter, who became proclaimers of the message of his resurrection. All 4 of the Gospels attest to all of those facts. If you were to include facts that were mentioned by, say, 3 out of the 4, well, then even more details could be added to the list. But I think it's clear that the core is well attested. In fact, N.T. Wright, an eminent British scholar, in his book on the resurrection, says that the empty tomb and appearances have such a historical probability as to be virtually certain, like the death of Augustus in AD 14 or the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. That is how well established these appearances and the discovery of the empty tomb are. Now, as I look more closely at what Shabir had to say, he didn't present any arguments against the crucifixion. He didn't deny the burial by Joseph of Arimathea. With respect to the empty tomb, he again said there are later developments in the Gospels, but again, that's why I focus on the core facts. He points out with respect to the appearances that Mark's Gospel ends before narrating any appearances. That's true, but Mark does foreshadow an appearance in Galilee, which is then narrated in Matthew as well as in John. And you can use the Greek New Testament to read these in the original languages, such as I do, so that we can read the original manuscripts as they actually existed. With respect to the appearances, he says there's no corroborating evidence of the appearances, and that's simply false, as I explained in my first speech. In the Gospels, we have multiple independent sources for these appearances. The appearance to Peter is attested by both Luke and independently by Paul. The appearance to the 12, independently by Luke, John, and Paul. The appearance to women by Matthew and John, and the Galilean appearances by Mark, Matthew, and John. This is one of the surest marks of historicity, because you have independent sources narrating the same event, which increases the historical credibility of those events. And finally, I pointed out that the original disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection was something that needs to be explained. Now, what is the best explanation of these? Well, I think it is the one the disciples gave, namely that God raised Jesus from the dead. What Shabir contends in his published work is that the best explanation is to say that Jesus was taken down from the cross barely alive, placed in the tomb, and then God assumed him directly into heaven before he could die. Now, I want to make a few observations about this theory. First of all, a preliminary observation. No true Muslim can hold to this view. The Quran is very straightforward and unambiguous. It says, وَمَا خَرَلُوهُ وَمَا صَلَبُوهُ. They did not kill him. They did not crucify him. The ambiguity that Shabir is talking about is in the latter part of that verse, وَإِنَّمَا شُبِهَ لَهُمْ, which says it only appeared to them that they did. But the first part is very clear, straightforwardly and unambiguously. The Quran says they did not crucify Jesus. They did not kill Jesus. Unfortunately, the Quran is straightforwardly and unambiguously mistaken in this. The evidence is overwhelming for Jesus' crucifixion. And that's why Shabir deserts the Quran and instead affirms that, in fact, Jesus was crucified, but he wasn't killed. And as a result, what Shabir winds up with is a view that is neither Islam nor Christianity, but a kind of mishmash of the truth, what we might call Chrislam, a sort of mishmash of Christianity and Islam. Namely, Jesus was crucified, but he didn't die. But what I want to know is, if you've already deserted Islam by denying that the Quran is correct in saying that Jesus was not crucified, why not be consistent and go all the way and say that, yes, he was crucified and he was killed and then raised from the dead? And I do think that this is the view Shabir should adopt, because his own view has real problems, I think, both historically and theologically. Let me mention some historical objections to his view. First, mere visionary appearances cannot explain the origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection. The German scholar Hans Kessler points out that the idea of an isolated resurrection before the general resurrection at the end of the world goes against all prior Jewish modes of thought. So if the disciples saw visions of Jesus, as Shabir admits that they did, they wouldn't have concluded he was risen from the dead. As James D.G. Dunn, whom Shabir quoted in his opening speech, says, It remains an indisputable fact that the earliest believers were absolutely convinced that they had seen Jesus risen from the dead. And yet, why did they conclude that it was Jesus risen from the dead? Why not simply a vision of the dead man? Why draw the astonishing conclusion that the resurrection had already taken place in the case of a single individual, separate from and prior to the general resurrection? There isn't any good answer to that question on Shabir's view. Mere visions of Jesus after his death would not lead to belief in his resurrection. Second problem is that the New Testament consistently draws a distinction between a resurrection appearance of Jesus and mere visions of Jesus. The appearances were confined to a short period of time following the crucifixion, but visions of the exalted Christ went on in the early church. Even Gerhard Ludemann admits that most scholars recognize this distinction. And what that means is you can't explain the resurrection appearances as mere visions, as Shabir wants to do. Third problem historically is that it's highly improbable that Jesus was still alive when he was taken down from the cross. The Romans were professional executioners. They were good at killing people. If Jesus had still been alive, they would have broken his legs so as to ensure his death on the cross. And in any case, the spear thrust into Jesus' side by one of the soldiers is an attested method of ensuring death by crucifixion that is found in Roman sources outside the New Testament. So in short, Shabir's hypothesis lacks, I think, explanatory scope, explanatory power, and plausibility. But not only are there historical objections, there are theological objections to this view. Two of them I want to mention. Number one, it comes too little, too late. For Jesus has already been exposed to humiliation, suffering, and shame by his crucifixion. He's already been shown to be under a curse, according to Mosaic law, by being crucified. The Jews thought at least that they had killed him. The Quran says, it records the boast of the Jews. We have put to death the Messiah, Jesus, the son of Mary. And you can almost hear them saying, ha, ha, ha. They were boasting that they had killed Jesus. As long as they thought they had done this, there's no point in bringing him back to life or raising him to heaven from inside the tomb once he's already been humiliated, suffered, and crucified. It comes too little, too late. Secondly, Shabir's hypothesis turns God into a deceiver who fooled the disciples into believing that Christ was risen from the dead, thereby causing Christianity to come into being. On Shabir's view, it is Allah himself who is responsible for foisting the false religion of Christianity upon the world. According to the hadith of Sahih Muslim, on the day of resurrection, Christians will be summoned by God and thrown into the fires of hell because they worship Jesus as the Son of God. And yet, according to Shabir's view, it is God himself who is responsible for this blasphemy by tricking the disciples into thinking Jesus was risen from the dead and thereby foisting the Christian religion upon the world. So Shabir's view is not only, I think, historically implausible, but it's also, I think, theologically hopeless as well. I think that his view is vastly inferior to the resurrection hypothesis, which was, after all, the hypothesis that the original disciples gave to explain their experience of Jesus after his death.
Thank you very much, Dr. Craig. We now invite Mr. Ali up for his 12-minute first rebuttal.
Thank you, Dr. Craig, for that engaging response. And you're obviously a man of humor yourself. Chris Lam? There is more to that verse than Dr. Craig has been able to explain. He focused on the ending of that verse, but the Muslim commentators focused on the middle section of that verse, which says, "Ma qataluhu wa ma salabuhu." They killed him not, they did not crucify him. And they took that to be two separate statements without seeing the the overlapping and the continuity between the two of them. We have this occurring in the Quran. The Quran says if you are killed or if you die. Of course, if you are killed, you die. But there are two separate modes being spoken about. Killed, meaning that you're killed by some other entity, and die, meaning that you just simply die by what people might call natural causes. In this case, they killed him not, they did not crucify him. Seems to be two separate statements, but there is an overlap. And we can see that wherever in the Quran the term crucifixion is used, it means to kill by the specific method of crucifixion. We have this, for example, in Surah 5, verse 33, where the penalty for a group of people referred to as the muharibun is that they may be either killed or crucified. So the or here may seem that obviously that there is no overlap, but obviously there is an overlap. The person might be killed by some other method or might be killed by the specific method of crucifixion. To me then, what the Quran Surah 4 verse 157 is saying about Jesus is that they killed him not by some other means, nor did they kill him by the specific means of crucifixion. Why is there a need for the mention of the specific method of crucifixion? I don't know. But there could be some interesting possibilities. It could be because there is a Jewish method of killing blasphemers, stoning, and there is the Roman method of killing criminals, crucifixion. The Quran could be saying that the Jews, even though they boasted that they killed Jesus, they neither killed him by their means, nor did they, as a matter of fact, crucify him, because after all, crucifixion is not their method. Or it could be just simply to say that they did not kill him, and responding already to the suggestion in their minds, but didn't we crucify him? And the Quran answers, no, neither did you crucify him. And that, of course, is a method of Quranic discourse as well, where the Quran answers the objections that may arise in the mind of the reader as it goes. As we ourselves may do in some of our essays, when we anticipate an objection, we write the answer to the objection immediately, dealing with the anticipated objection. So in short, I don't have to be a Christ Muslim to have that interpretation, but as I said, there's a variety of interpretations offered for this verse, and it would have been binding on me had we had a clear interpretation of this verse attributed to the Prophet Muhammad himself, because he's the primary commentator on the Quran. The farthest back we can go with this is attributions to Ibn Abbas, who, though being an important commentator, have had all kinds of conflicting opinions attributed to him. A positive point and also its negation. So one has to be careful in taking these attributions. In any case, after all, he may have explained certain things based on his own knowledge or based on what he received from informers of Jewish and Christian origins, and in that case, it's not necessary that Muslims should adhere to those interpretations. So much for the interpretation of the Quran. What about the fact of crucifixion? Of course, what Dr. Craig is stressing is that Jesus died by crucifixion, and that this is attested widely by historians. Let me step back for a moment and say something about his 5 so-called facts. Now, after his debate with Gerd Ludemann, Robert Gondry complained that Dr. Craig should not call these facts. He means that these are propositions and purported facts. And he accepted the correction, but it looks like we're back where we started, Dr. Craig. They're not facts, they're your contentions. What about the fact that Jesus died by crucifixion? Well, the scholars who say that Jesus died by crucifixion accept that as a fact because we presuppose that anyone who was alive 2,000 years ago is by now dead. And if he's missing, well, then he's presumed dead. The scholars that we're dealing with are just simply presuming that Jesus died and that's the end of it. If we would have the number of scholars agreeing that Jesus was crucified and died by the method, agreeing that Jesus also resurrected from the dead, that's a different matter. And that brings me to another point about Dr. Craig's facts. What he does is that he borrows what some scholars said about one fact and what some scholars said about the other fact. And then he tells us that the majority of scholars, but they're not the same majority of scholars. You may have a situation where within certain conservative or evangelical circles you have a large number of scholars still holding to the fact of the resurrection of Jesus, and or to the belief in the resurrection of Jesus. And they would cull together a number of facts that they think support that final conclusion, including the fact that he died by crucifixion, the tomb was empty and discovered empty, he appeared to his disciples, and so on. But on the other hand, if you mention, for example, Michael Grant, as Dr. Craig has mentioned in support of one of his facts, we'll find that the same scholar does not hold to the fact that Jesus resurrected from the dead, and he thinks that Jesus also already preconditioned his disciples in such a way that after his event of the crucifixion, they naturally believed that they were seeing Jesus, not that Jesus actually appeared to them. So the same scholar, agreeing to one of these facts, actually disagrees with the other. In a similar way, he cited Gerd Ludemann as attesting to the fact that Jesus appeared to his disciples. But for Gerd Ludemann, these appearances were not of Jesus actually appearing to his disciples, but of his disciples thinking that they were seeing Jesus, but in fact hallucinating. So we cannot take these scholars and say that these 5 facts are agreed on by the majority of scholars, because it's not the same majority. Some scholars hold to this fact, and some scholars hold to the other fact, but not to that one. And so what the scholars are doing is that they're looking at the divergent information that I spoke to you about in my opening speech, and they're asking what of this could really be true? What has to go and what can remain? So some shave off some parts of it which they think are totally unacceptable. Like, for example, Matthew's depiction of the dead coming back to life. Matthew says that at the moment of Jesus' crucifixion, or at the moment of his death, there was a terrible earthquake, the tombs were opened, and the saints from old came back to life. And after Jesus' resurrection, they went into the city and were seen by many people. Most scholars dispute that fact. And Dr. Craig doesn't want to think about inerrancy, but you have to, because if Matthew can invent such an important and major statement about something that has happened, the resurrection of such multiple saints, then what else did he invent? That's a very important question. Dr. Craig himself has remarked that only a few conservative scholars will hold to that as a fact today. So, if we were to continue, the understanding that Jesus died of crucifixion is just simply because of the time in which he lived and the 2,000 years that separate him from us. But if we ask, what verification was there really that Jesus actually died at the time? You'll be surprised that according to Jan Bondison, it was for many centuries a puzzle for people to determine precisely the moment of death. In fact, it still remains a puzzle to this day. And occasionally we read about somebody who actually was presumed dead, and after all the arrangements were made to bury him, he actually miraculously comes back to life. Because, of course, something is mysterious here, and it's difficult to understand. John Bondison even quotes Pliny, the historian, Pliny the Younger, from the time of the early church, who actually expressed his dismay that we cannot really determine finally the time of death, because there were so many instances of a person presumed dead who actually came back to life. And the New Testament itself, in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 14, the Jews stoned Paul and left him for dead, but when they left, he got up and walked away. Acts chapter 14. So we have instances where in that time people could not determine finally that a person was actually dead. What about the spear thrust in Jesus' side? Notice Dr. Craig's careful wording. It is attested that this was a method used in crucifixion. He means generally. But was it used specifically in the case of Jesus? I think Dr. Craig will have to admit that that was not the case. We do not have a proper attestation. We have John's Gospel saying this, but remember that John was the last of the 4 Gospels to be written. The writers of the 4 Gospels did not have specific information. They just wrote in a general way based on the general knowledge of what normally happened at crucifixions. John, in his case, being the last of the 4, is dealing with the fact that people were doubting that Jesus actually died, and he introduced a spear thrust to convince those who might doubt. Pilate, according to Mark's Gospel, had wondered if Jesus died so soon when the body was requested for burial. But Matthew and Mark, remember, Matthew and Luke were copying Mark. What did they do with this fact that Pilate expressed doubt? They didn't mention it. Raymond Brown, dealing with this, says that Matthew and Luke obviously omitted this because they didn't want their readers to ask the same question which readers of Mark will ask. When readers of Mark read that Pilate doubted that Jesus had died so soon, they themselves, readers of Matthew, the readers themselves will start asking, well, wait a minute, was he really dead? So Matthew and Luke, the later Gospels, not wanting the same question to be asked by their readers, just simply omitted the mention. Of course, now the 4 Gospels are together. You can read them all. But at the time when they were first written and circulated, they were in separate scrolls and circulated in different areas. Traditionally, it was said that Mark was written at Rome, Matthew at Antioch, Luke at Caesarea, and John at Ephesus. So different writers were writing for different audiences, and they modified the facts in order to prove their own apologetic points. So Dr. Craig thinks that he's starting with certain facts which are distilled from the Gospels, which he can champion now in his own apologetic discourse, not realizing, or not, he has actually, because he recommended the book History of Apologetics, but not bringing to his consciousness the fact that he's already dealing with apologetically introduced points that he is now using to base his interpretation. They are already interpretations, they are not facts. And I leave that with you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ali. We now call upon Dr. Craig to deliver his 8-minute final rebuttal.
You remember my first contention is that there are 5 facts about the historical Jesus which any adequate historical hypothesis must account for. Now, despite all of the tempest in a teapot about this, the fact is that Shabir agrees with all 5 of those facts because his own apparent death theory is an attempt to explain them, namely that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified, despite what the Quran says, that he was buried in a tomb, Shabir agrees, that that tomb was found empty, that there were then multiple appearances to different individuals and groups, and that the original disciples came to believe that Jesus was risen from the dead. We agree on those facts. Now, Shabir does protest, but these are not accepted by the same scholars in every case. What I'm saying is that these are accepted by the wide mainstream of New Testament scholarship. Now, I know those of you who are not Christian believers find this hard to accept. You find this incredible. But in fact, if you study the literature, this is true. My friend Gary Habermas recently did a bibliographical survey of 1,400 articles published in professional journals over the last 25 years on these subjects. What he found was that 75% of scholars writing on the subject agreed with the historicity of the empty tomb, and there was nearly universal agreement on the resurrection appearances to individuals and groups and the origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection. So I stand squarely within the mainstream of New Testament historical scholarship in affirming these facts. Now, what is the best explanation of the facts? The one the disciples gave or Shabir's apparent death theory? I said, first of all, that no sincere Muslim can hold to the apparent death theory because the Quran says unambiguously and straightforwardly that Jesus was not crucified. Here I need my Quran. And Shabir says, no, you're misinterpreting the verse, and gives an example in Surah 5:33 that he says is supposed to suggest the same sort of ambiguity. Here's what that verse says. Those that make war against God and his apostle and spread disorder in the land shall be slain or crucified or have their hands and feet cut off on alternate sides or be banished from the land. It's clear here they're not equating being slain and being crucified. It's talking about different alternative means of punishment. And that's not the same phraseology that's found in Surah 4:157, which, as I said, says, وَمَا قَتَلُوهُ وَمَا صَلَبُوهُ. They did not kill him. They did not crucify him. It couldn't be more plain or straightforward. Now, Shabir says, well, maybe in saying they didn't crucify him, what it means is, well, the Jews didn't crucify him. Maybe it was really the Romans. This is simply a misreading of the passage. Kenneth Craig, a very famous Islamicist, has written in this regard. It has been suggested that the intention is to indicate a non-Jewish subject of the verb, presumably the Romans or even God himself. This makes havoc both of the Arabic construction and of the evidence sense. If the context intended to substitute the Romans, it would surely have to say, it was not they, the Jews, who killed him, it was the Romans. There is no such construction here, nor could it tally if there were with the rest of the passage. We cannot escape the negation of crucifying by confusion as to the agent. The Quran is clear and unambiguous. Unfortunately, it is clear and unambiguously mistaken in saying that Jesus was not crucified. So I think, indeed, Shabir is guilty of endorsing Chrislam rather than being a faithful Muslim. And if you are a Muslim tonight, I don't think you can follow him in his theory. Then I raised historical objections to his theory. Number one, that visions of Jesus, which he says Allah granted the disciples, wouldn't be sufficient to explain belief in his resurrection. Shabir didn't respond to the point. Secondly, I pointed out that visions are not identical to resurrection appearances. There is a distinction between the two, such that mere visions of Jesus don't mean appearances. Shabir didn't respond to that point. Thirdly, I said it's highly improbable that Jesus was taken down still alive. The Romans were professional executioners. He says, well, he could have been alive. Sure, there's a possibility, but the point is it's highly, highly improbable. This apparent death theory was already tried in liberal German theology in the late 1700s, early 1800s. It has been unanimously rejected by contemporary scholars. Josephus, the Jewish historian, tells an incident in which he came upon 3 persons who were acquaintances of his that he found had been crucified. And he immediately talked to the Roman authorities and got them taken down. And yet, despite the best attention medically that Rome could give, 2 of them died immediately and the third died sometime thereafter. The idea that Jesus could have survived his scourging and crucifixion, I think, is just highly, highly improbable. The spear thrust in the side, remember I said, was common practice done by Roman executioners, and that would ensure his death. As for Pilate being surprised that he died so soon, that's right, it was a quick death, and so Pilate determined from the centurion that he was really dead. They verified his death, and that's why they didn't break his leg. So I think Shabir's theory is at least highly improbable. What about the theological objections I raised to it? I said, first of all, it's too little too late. Saving Jesus after he's already been crucified and taken down and placed in the tomb doesn't do anything to save God's prophet. He has already been humiliated and shamed before his enemies. It's just too little too late. But secondly, it makes God responsible for the delusion of Christianity and hundreds of millions of people going to hell forever for believing in Christ as the risen Son of God. And all of the problems that Christianity has been for Islam over the centuries, all of this is a result of Allah's own doing in misleading the original disciples and thinking Jesus had been risen from the dead. So it just seems to me that theologically speaking, this theory is really quite preposterous. Frankly, it is a desperate attempt to try to save the phenomena, to try to admit all the facts, the 5 facts, and yet to figure out some other way to explain them without recurring to the resurrection of Jesus. But it is a highly improbable theory. It is a theologically objectionable theory. And I would just say, why not? Go with the theory that the original eyewitnesses gave. Why not believe these men when they said God has raised him from the dead? A belief for which they were willing to give their lives. I think that they were telling the truth, and I can't see any reason to adopt this Chrislamic theory as the alternative to it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Craig. And now we call upon Mr. Ali for the final rebuttal speech of the evening.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Dr. Craig. Again, that was very engaging, and I'm very glad that we're having this discussion. Notice what happens when we discuss the same point, and if you follow the trace of what is being discussed. I said that Dr. Craig spoke about the spear thrust in a general way, and now he's come back and spoken about it in a more specific way, but still not quite to the point. He did not get to the point of saying that this actually happened in the case of Jesus, because obviously we cannot depend on John's gospel on this. So in sum, we do not have a specific mention of some specific item that definitely killed Jesus. No such mention. Now he says it is common practice. Now he's upping the statement a little bit, but I would like to get some documentation to show that this is actually common practice. Actually, the Gospel of John, in mentioning this, gives the impression that it was not commonly done. It may be done, but it was not commonly done. So I think Dr. Craig is just, for apologetic reasons, improving upon the evidence here. He says that I didn't answer anything about the crucifixion or burial or empty tomb, but if you follow my discourse, I have been answering. I have been speaking about the way in which the crucifixion does not actually contribute to a final conclusion that Dr. Craig wants to reach, because Jesus may not have actually died on the cross. And if you say that Jesus appeared again alive, but he wasn't dead in the first place, well, then you do not have a resurrection, you have a resuscitation. So in that case, what need is there to deny the burial or even the empty tomb if the rest of the evidence do not actually add up to a resurrection, which is what the topic of our discussion is tonight. What about the appearances? Notice that Dr. Craig says that these appearances were multiply and independently attested. The key word there is independently. If we say that Paul said something and then Luke, his physician, wrote the same thing, is that independent? If we say that Mark said something and then Matthew and Luke, depending on Mark, said the same thing, is that independent? Obviously, you're dealing here with a development within early Christianity. And actually, assumption was an earlier form of expression about the vindication of Jesus than resurrection. And this has been put forward in a PhD thesis by Daniel Smith, in his now published in his book, The Vindication of Jesus in the Sayings Gospel Q. Smith puts forward the hypothesis under his professor, the Q Gospel scholar, Kloppenberg at the University of Toronto, and he has given ample evidence to show that an earlier form of proclamation about Jesus was that Jesus actually was assumed into heaven. An assumption is different from resurrection, whereas resurrection, you have the dead person coming out from where he is buried, and he appears to his disciples. Assumption means he's taken up by God from where he is dead or where he's not dead, and then in some way his disciples may be able to proclaim that he has now been exalted by God. If you look at Mark's gospel, he actually makes this case based on the gospel Q. But he also shows us that by parallel, if we look at the ending of Mark's gospel, we have it that Mark ends at Mark chapter 16, verse 8, as I've already spoken about. But verse number 7 spoke about the angel saying to the women that Jesus is going ahead and you will see him in Galilee. That verse number 7, has actually been disputed by many scholars. They think that that verse was not in the pre-Markan source, and Mark introduced this. When we realize this, then we understand that Mark's gospel source did not speak about a resurrection of Jesus from the dead, but an assumption of Jesus into heaven from wherever he was. Now, there is a dispute as to whether Jesus was actually dead or whether he was actually assumed into heaven alive. A German scholar, Dieter Zeller, actually puts forward the hypothesis that the Q gospel does not mention the death of Jesus because assumption was the paradigm by which it was understood that Jesus was exalted into heaven, and assumption generally did not go with death but went with non-death. And this will parallel what has happened to some biblical figures like Enoch, who according to Genesis walked with God and he was no more because God took him. And Elijah in the book of Kings, who actually was taken up by God in a whirlwind. They did not die, but they were assumed into heaven. Does assumption actually count against the Quran? I think if we're speaking about the Greek language and some details of the New Testament, unless I rely on New Testament scholars, I would have to defer to Dr. Craig on what he says. I think in a similar way, in the case of the Quran, I would like to put before you that I am a student of the Quran. Exegesis of the Quran is in fact my specialty. And I believe I know what I'm saying in this regard. But you don't have to take my word for it. I can also cite passages which, in fact, have a bearing on our discussion that have not really come up yet, but they are important. In more than one place, the Quran speaks and says that Jesus actually was taken in such a way that the term used is ambiguous as to whether or not Jesus died. The term is tawaffa, which in Arabic actually can, as a euphemism, refer to death, but it is not the original word for death. The word for death in Arabic is mata, he died. Tawaffa or tuwaffiya is a common way of saying that somebody died, but it is a euphemism, as if we said that somebody has passed on to meet his Lord. So the Quran says that God said to Jesus in Surah 3, verse 55, Inni mutawaffika wa rafi'uka ilayya. I am going to take you and raise you to myself. So that take is the word that is generally used as meaning taken in death. But it could also be taken in sleep. And this is where the classical commentators differed. They could not decide, did God take Jesus in sleep or in death? So while they denied that Jesus was killed by his enemies on the cross, some of them affirmed that Jesus actually died and then God took him. Or some said that God took him in sleep. In a similar way, Surah 5, verse 117 says, If qala Allahu, when God said to Isa, and then Isa replies, Falamma tawaffaytani, when you took me, the same verb, which could mean when you took me in death or when you took me in sleep. Now, from the details that we have, given the discussions that we have found, given the thesis of Daniel Smith and others, it is clear that there was, in an earlier proclamation before the Gospels were written, the declaration that Jesus was exalted into heaven, a declaration that fitted more with the idea of assumption and not necessitating a resurrection from the dead. This is why we do not have in Mark's Gospel a further narrative which shows that Jesus appeared to his disciples, because that would be resurrection. And the original proclamation in Mark's source was actually about assumption. Reginald Fuller, in his formation of the gospel narratives, actually told us too that in Mark's source, minus Mark 16:7, obviously we are dealing here not with a resurrection from the dead, but with an assumption of Jesus into heaven. So how certain were they that Jesus actually died on the cross? They couldn't be certain, because in fact they came to break the legs of the crucified victims to ensure their death, to hasten their death. But they didn't break the legs of Jesus according to the gospel. So what then finally killed Jesus? In fact, we have no record. And the Josephus story shows that these guys were up on the cross for 3 days and then taken down, and still one survived. Jesus was only on the cross for a few hours. What killed him?
Thank you very much, Mr. Ali. We now call Dr. Craig to close out his side of the debate in his 5-minute closing address.
Well, we've certainly gotten into some technical issues of New Testament and Quranic scholarship this evening, but I hope that it has at least provoked your interest to look further into these matters. I've defended 2 contentions tonight. First, that there are 5 generally accepted facts about the historical Jesus that need to be explained: his crucifixion, his entombment, the discovery of the empty tomb, the resurrection appearances, and the origin of the disciples' belief. Shabir agrees with all 5 of those facts. Where we differ is, while he agrees Jesus was crucified, he doesn't think that Jesus died by crucifixion. But apart from that, we do agree on those 5 facts. So the real debate comes down to what is the best explanation for these 5 facts. And I suggested that Shabir's view is deficient in a number of ways. First, historically, I said, it lacks explanatory scope because it can't explain the origin of belief in the resurrection. It lacks explanatory power because visions are not the same thing as appearances. And finally, thirdly, it's historically improbable. Now, in his last speech, Shabir attempted to respond to this by saying, well, the primitive Christian belief was not in resurrection of the dead. It was actually in assumption or exaltation into heaven. And I submit to you that that is simply false. In 1 Corinthians 15:3, remember Paul quotes that old source that goes back to within 5 years of the crucifixion and even closer. And in it, it says, Christ died for our sins, he was buried, and he was raised on the 3rd day in accordance with the Scriptures. Belief in the resurrection of Jesus was the primitive belief, and exaltation was part of resurrection. He was not assumed into heaven. N.T. Wright, in his book on the resurrection, says the idea that there was originally no difference for the earliest Christians between resurrection and exaltation ascension is a 20th century fiction based on a misreading of Paul. Our Raymond Brown has said, with respect to belief in the resurrection, it is not accurate to claim that New Testament references to the resurrection of Jesus are ambiguous as to whether they mean bodily resurrection. There was no other kind of resurrection, says Raymond Brown. So I think it's clear that in the primitive belief, the earliest Christians believed in and proclaimed the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And visions, such as you have on Shabir's hypothesis, just doesn't cut the mustard in explaining that. What about the improbability of Jesus being still alive when he was taken down from the cross? The reference for the spear thrust in the side comes from the Roman author Quintilian and is given in my published work. I cannot prove that it actually happened in Jesus' case, but what we can show is that this is a Roman executioner's process to ensure death, as is the breaking of the legs. John knows both the breaking of the legs as well as the spear thrust, which shows that he is right in touch with first century normal practices of Roman execution. And therefore, I think we have no reason to doubt that Jesus was taken down dead, which was, after all, the job of these Roman executioners to ensure. Then the theological objections have never been answered in tonight's debate, that Shabir's hypothesis is just too little, too late, and it makes God responsible for the delusion of Christianity and all these hundreds of millions of people going to hell for believing something that Allah deceived them into believing by presenting them with visions of Jesus and an empty tomb and making them think that he was risen from the dead. So if you're a Muslim student here tonight, I want to encourage you to try to think outside the box. Try not to let your beliefs be determined just by your family and what they might think or what your friends might think. I would encourage you to begin to think for yourself about the claims of Jesus of Nazareth and who he is and whether he might not be who he really is. I wasn't raised in a Christian home myself, but I became a Christian as a teenager when I began to search for the big questions in life. I began to read the New Testament, and I found in the teaching and person of Jesus a wisdom that I'd never encountered anywhere else and an authenticity in this man's life that was just undeniable. And I eventually became a Christian, and it changed my life. Tonight, out in the foyer, the Gideons are going to be giving away free New Testaments to any Muslim student who would like one. And I'd encourage you to pick up one of these, take it home, and do what I did. Read it and ask yourself, could Jesus really be who he claimed to be? God raised him from the dead as a divine authentication of those radical claims for which he was crucified. And I think that it could change your life in the same way that it changed mine. Thank you for sharing this debate with me tonight.
Thank you very much, Dr. Craig, and we now call upon Mr. Ali to close out this round of debate.
And now, finally, what about the theological objection to the Muslim position in this discourse? The idea that God is a deceiver has been launched against the Muslim position based on what Muslims had explained classically, that God made someone look like Jesus, have that someone crucified, and then Christians have asked, well, doesn't that make God a deceiver in the whole process? But I don't see how that objection counts against what I have explained. When I trace the development of early Christian theology, and I see that there was an early proclamation of the assumption of Jesus from the tomb prior to the writing of Mark and the other Gospels, in that case, all we needed is for the disciples to be assured that despite whatever opposition Jesus faced, God was still with Jesus. God exalted Jesus into heaven. In that case, they would go on with their preaching. The Christian religion would start. Where did this deception actually come about? How did people get to the idea that Jesus was the Son of God and eventually to worship him, and then that led to the councils? Well, I believe it started with the teaching of some people who were not disciples of Jesus, especially the Apostle Paul. It is in his book, in his writing to the Galatians, chapter 3, verse 13, that Paul said that Jesus died as a curse for us. What Paul has done there is Paul had actually accepted the interpretation that Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 22 and 23 actually can refer to Jesus, and that would make Jesus an accursed person because he hung on a cross. Obviously, that passage cannot refer to Jesus. It must refer to a person who hung on a cross for a crime that he actually committed, a heinous crime. And in that case, the curse of God is upon him as well. If Jesus, an honest person, an innocent person, was seized by the authorities by hook or crook and then put on a cross, how is that the fault of Jesus? And why would the curse of God fall on Jesus? But Paul accepted that the curse of God has fallen upon Jesus. And now Paul set about to prove that Jesus resurrected from the dead. And apologists following in Paul's footsteps are trying to prove that Jesus resurrected from the dead. And they base everything on Christianity on this point. Either Christianity stands on or falls on the resurrection. But notice that based on the life and teachings of Jesus, and Dr. Craig alluded to this himself, when he said that based on the life and teachings of Jesus, this idea that he resurrected from the dead is in accord. His test for the plausibility of this, of his explanation is the best explanation. But that counts against his idea that the origin of the belief of the disciples must have necessitated this big bang. Because either you have Jesus proclaiming that he is someone special and his disciples believe that, and the crucifixion cannot let them fail in that, or you have them not knowing anything about Jesus, waiting to see would he be vindicated from the cross, and if they don't see that, then they think that he is now accursed. The idea of the married bachelor only applied to the specific idea that Jesus was the Davidic Messiah, but he may not have been. The Dead Sea Scrolls show us that in fact Jesus could have been one of three things and still be called Messiah. He could be the Davidic Messiah, or a priest Messiah, or a prophetic Messiah. And in that case, if he was not the Davidic Messiah, then the cross does not prove him wrong. He could have been believed to be a prophet, as Muslims think he was, and that belief would continue even after his crucifixion. Notice that when in the Gospel of Luke he meets the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, they still proclaim their belief in him as a man of God and as a great prophet. That means the crucifixion did not kill the belief in the disciples that Jesus was a great prophet. So there was no need for a big bang to upstart Christianity, and I think that Dr. Craig's hypothesis fails on this point. But then if there ever was someone who turned the tables here and made Jesus appear to be false, it is actually Paul, because he accepts as a matter of fact that Jesus died an accursed death. And if we now place ourselves on the Saturday following the crucifixion, we have to be in a position of not knowing anything but knowing that Jesus is an accursed person. Now, his disciples needed, according to the storyline, an appearance of Jesus to convince them that he was not an accursed person. What do we have except reports that contradict each other? If we go by the reports that are here, I find it very difficult to bring faith in Jesus. But if we go with the idea that Jesus was a prophet of God, and therefore God's Messiah, who lived a life of honor and piety with God and convinced his disciples that he is a man worthy of being followed, and that his disciples continued to believe in him despite his death, as Josephus the historian wrote, well then there is nothing else left to explain. The difficulty has been introduced, and it is now difficult to solve. The difficulty is to first proclaim that he was declared accursed by God, and now try to prove him innocent.